All right. Hi, everyone. Really excited to be here today. Welcome to our conversation. Super happy to be talking to Paige Hendrix Buckner today. Paige, maybe say hello to everyone.
Hey, hi Anya. Thanks for having me. Hey, folks in the chat. It's good to see you.
So we have a very good and exciting discussion for you today. Before we kick things off, we wanted to first do a quick introduction on what we'll be talking, and then of course Diversio and Always. So what we'll be discussing today is rewriting the risk playbook: how women are reshaping investing for a volatile future. We think, given everything that's happening in the world right now, with from the backlash when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, to the mandate to continue inclusive and high return investing strategies across GPs and LPs globally, we thought this was a great opportunity to kind of have a very frank and candid conversation about where we are and where we see ourselves going. So, quick note about Diversio. We are, of course, an end-to-end platform when it comes to workplace, people, and culture experience. So we collect data from employees, we process that data to understand employee demographics as well as their engagement within the organization, and we hopefully tell companies how to fix it. When it comes to our work with investors, we work with investors both internally on their teams, but also with their portfolio companies, because of course, a lot of investors want to make sure that their portcos are having inclusive teams, are maintaining productivity, and are bringing in diverse talent through the pipeline. So I'm Anya. I'm the co-founder and chief operating officer of Diversio. I oversee our product and client delivery teams. And I'm joined today, like I mentioned, by Paige Hendrix Buckner, who is the amazing, fantastic, and incredibly talented CEO of Always, which is a wonderful nonprofit advancing the success of female and non-binary investors by transforming culture of venture capital. So welcome, Paige. Super excited to have you here. Maybe I'll pass it over to you for a quick introduction of the amazing work that you do.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Anya. And I love the work that you all are doing. I remember learning about it last year and thinking how powerful it is, the data that you all are collecting. And so really excited to do that work together over the next several years. So hi, everyone. My name is Paige Hendrix Buckner, CEO of Always. And Always is an organization that imagines a world where women and non-binary folks are part of building and funding the future. And what that means to us is that we want to change the culture and composition of the venture capital ecosystem. So there are more women and non-binary folks leading companies as, the founders of those companies or the decision makers at venture capital firms. And we really see this as an opportunity to do two things. One is add more talent around the table that can spot new opportunity. And then as a result of that, get better outcomes for the organization. And there's so much great data around that. So I'm excited to dig into that today. I've been at Allraise now, it'll be 2 years as the CEO, and we're really focused on helping right now in this moment women and non-binary venture capitalists get their seat, keep their seat, and be successful in their seat. So that's a little bit more about us and what we do. Our members are all over the country, and we're super thrilled to be part of this conversation today.
Amazing. Thanks so much for that
Of course.
review page. So kicking things off, getting right into it, I think that the global political context right now, and just the majority of contexts are a little bit, let's say, turbulent. Maybe not what we've been used to for in the years leading up. And there's a lot more conversations around risk and recession and, global tariffs, the markets, as I'm sure you and everyone on the call knows. So how are you seeing the narrative shape up around risk in investing today? What has the last few months meant for the investor world? And in your experience, how are women investors thinking about acting on risk? And maybe what are some of those differences?
Yeah, great question. So I want to start out with the bigger context here, which is as we think about the contraction that's been happening in venture capital for the last few years, what we've noticed is that venture firms and startups alike have had to get leaner, right? They've had to ask, what are the essential business functions that will help us remain, competitive and be profitable and get us closer and closer to that big milestone, whether it's an IPO, it's an M&A event. And so as I think about that, one thing that I've been reflecting over the last couple of months is that so many of the firms that we're talking to or the startups have weathered volatility that we've seen over the last several years. I mean, how many times have you been part of a call where somebody has said, oh, hashtag unprecedented times? Like we're just constantly in unprecedented times. And so as a result, I do think that there's a muscle that folks have been building around being disciplined about how they leverage capital, again, whether they're at a firm or they're in a startup, and as they think deeply about like what's their competitive advantage and what's the thing that they do better than anyone else so they can keep doing it. So there's that piece of it. I think the second piece of it is, of course, we haven't seen the liquidity that people are hoping for this year. And so that also has, as I've talked to investors, um, created opportunities to be more creative about what that could look like. And so I've been excited to have those conversations. And so with all of that, then we ask a question about like, well, how are we thinking about risk during this time? And I think there are two themes that I've heard over and over again. Number one is, for VCs who've gotten into this business who have a really strong thesis, what I've heard over and over and over is stick to your thesis. There's a reason you're the right person to be in the market, looking for those opportunities, looking for those companies. And if that was clear from day one, you've got to stick to your focus now more than ever, because that will help you navigate the volatility or just all the noise. Because we talked about this yesterday. There's a lot of noise out there, right, Anya? And it's hard to find the signal. I think number two is this also provides an opportunity to really be disciplined about not just the companies you make a bet on, but then also disciplined in how you provide support for your portfolio companies. So, how can you really dig in and make sure that they can, again, they're being as efficient as possible? They have the resources they need to be successful. Because I think the really important thing to note here about venture capital it's not just about the money, right? It's about the network and the brand and the expertise that you get when you partner with that firm. And so when I think about all raisers who are predominantly women and non-binary folks, but we also have lots of men who are part of our community, what I'm hearing from them is it's making them sharper at their job and really focusing on how do I make sure that the companies I've already invested in are successful and can navigate this time. So being a good steward with them. But the second piece of it is as they're making bets moving forward, not allowing the noise to make them jump into a deal that maybe isn't a good fit for them and is really feels very bubbly because
Yeah.
of all the FOMO around it. So that's what I'm hearing, Anya. I'm actually kind of curious about your perspective. We didn't talk about this yesterday, so what are you thinking and feeling about this?
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, first of all, I think your points are very bang on. I think that there is almost an inertia to be reactive during this time. And I think it's what you said yesterday, right? You want to be responsive, but not reactive. I thought that that was really well said. And that's what I think is going to get you through this period where there's a lot of volatility and there's a lot of noise. I think for investors specifically, it's interesting because I did some work for Vicky, which is the venture capital catalyst initiative in Canada, which essentially allocates funding to emerging funds, and it's curious because there are a lot of funds that are still quite nascent in Canada. And during these times of turbulence, there will be this sense of, not necessarily panic, but this sense of discomfort. And one of the kind of pieces of advice that we were giving during the allocation of funding is stick to your thesis. There's a reason why, you received the funding from your LPs. And if you're thinking about long-term outcomes, you need to have a long-term investment strategy. And, on the venture front, there is a shorter time horizon, so potentially a little bit more of that turbulence. But if you're looking at different asset classes, if you're looking at things like infrastructure or private equity or what have you, the time horizon is a lot longer. So I think that keeping that in mind, despite the fact that the market is kind of going up and down and there are those pressures, becomes really increasingly important. So basically I just parroted back to you what you said.
Great.
because
That's
I agree.
perfect, Anya. We're
Yeah.
saying the same, but I think the piece that you just talked about, like, and when where you started, what we talked about yesterday was this, not being reactive and being responsive. And I think inherent in being responsive means that you've taken time to reflect
Yeah.
and think about strategically the best next step and not just try to take a bunch of quick actions. I can't, I can think of very few scenarios um, in which I can see people taking just a flurry of activity during a highly stressful time where you're going to make the most informed decision you can. So, yeah, I think an opportunity to just stick to your focus is great.
100%. Well, building on top of that, during volatile times, a lot of the times, investors or companies themselves, they will sort of huddle in, right? They won't necessarily contract, but they will sort of they'll stop taking necessarily certain chances or risks that they would have potentially taken before. And the question comes down to how do we maintain the momentum that we're building on underrepresented investors and founders when capital is potentially contracting and when, risk appetite is inherently a little bit lower.
I think this is a question that I actually started thinking about when I started as a founder, which was back in 2014. So this isn't an old question because I think it comes up in cycles as
Yeah.
we reflect on what's happening in the economy. People default to who they know and what they know in an effort to stay as safe as possible, whether that's a hiring decision or that's an investment decision. And so I think in these moments, there are a couple things I've been reflecting on. Number one is what does the data tell us about where to make bets? And when we specifically think about adding more women and non-binary folks to a decision-making team, I go back to that 2023 McKinsey data that says companies in the top quartile for gender diversity were 25% more likely to achieve above average profitability than their peers. And so I'm going back to the data to ground myself in decisions. I think number two is how do your processes and systems reflect that data so you can capture all the potential opportunity out there? And I think if you look at a venture capital firm, one way to think about it could be assessing your deal flow, making sure that you have diverse networks so you can identify those opportunities, whether it's geographically diverse or because of gender or race, or casting the net wider for class. Like you're looking for people who are providing you with outlier opportunities. And when you can cast the net wider, you're getting a shot at those. You're getting more shots on goal. So I think there's an opportunity to take that data, then use that to make decisions about how you improve your process and systems. To identify new opportunities at the earliest stages when you consider deal flow. And then through the diligence process, how again are you using that data to make choices about the biggest and the best opportunities. I've been thinking quite a bit about Ulu Ventures. They recently just announced their Fund 4. So that's Miriam and Clint. They're incredible human beings, stellar investors. And what's really exciting to hear from them is how they lean into their data and how they leverage data to make strong decisions. Again, that helps them weather the storm and the noise. So when we consider decisions around risk, I think we need to go back to the data and ask ourselves, what does it tell us about the opportunity there? And how might our inherent biases that we've then operationalized through our systems and processes have prevented us from finding those opportunities and securing them. And I think for us, one thing we think about is that this is the reason why it's so important to have women and non-binary decision makers at the table. And there's a great Harvard Kennedy School piece that talks about VC firms with 10% more female investing partners being hired, making more successful investments at the portfolio company level, and having 1.5% higher fund returns, as well as 9.7% more profitable exits. So, again, in those moments where we're like, why are we making these choices? Why is it still important to have a variety of perspectives at the table? It's because the data says it's good for business, whether
Yeah.
you're on the VC side or you're on the founder side.
I love the stats. You always
We
come with
love a
perspective.
stat,
You
Anya.
always want to bring
You
respect.
know,
You
you
want to be
got
like,
them.
this is, yeah, exactly. This is what the reality is. I read another one the other day, which was really interesting, which was in 2023, 47% of angel investors in the US were actually women. which I think it is so fascinating. And it's such a market shift from what we've seen in previous years. And it's also being reflected, for example, in clientele for wealth management across like banks and institutions. A lot of it is actually now becoming women. And the way that investment strategies are shifting as a result, or the way who gets funded, hopefully as a result, I'm excited to see what impact that has, because despite the fact that we're in some latest turbulent times these past few months, those are sort of more seismic trends that are happening over time that hopefully won't go anywhere anytime soon.
I think that's right. And one thing I've also been digging into a little bit more is the shifting demographics in the United States. And there's a great piece that was written by Nisha Dua over at BBGV, and it's all about the polycultural future of America. And so when we talk about polyculturalism, and I would say this, and I would love to hear your perspective in Canada as well. What I think about are market opportunities that if you're not part of those communities, if you can't build human-centered experiences, products, and services that are really rooted in people's real needs and real
Yeah.
problems, then you're not building for the markets that will be able to get you the kind of traction and the kind of scale that you'll need to see in a company in the next 10 to 20 years. So, I mean, again, like I just keep coming back to the data and the math. So curious about your perspective regarding polyculturalism in Canada.
No, it's such a huge topic, I think, to discuss. And you're ultimately, you want to follow the purchasing power, right? You want to, as you're making
Yes, this
a
part.
company, you want to follow, okay, who has the power, the buying power in the market? What do they want? And then how are we servicing them? And I'm finding that there's, influx, hopefully, of solutions that are now becoming more visible, that previously maybe wouldn't, that are addressing problems of, let's say in Canada, new Canadians, or our Indigenous communities, or even women. I mean, the founder story of the dancer, and oh my gosh, I have a terrible memory, so her name escapes me, but the woman who founded Mirror, that was then bought by, I think it was Lululemon or what have you, in that workout routine that she was, and it was like an incredible success story for the business itself. And I just think that the more we're focusing on what are the problems of the communities that we're serving, they're going to buy the solutions, and that's ultimately, it's that simple, right?
I think that's exactly right. And when you dive into that piece or that wonderful body of research that BBGV GV did, one of the things they talked about was widening age gaps. So aging America, one of the things
Yeah.
that they point out is while much attention has been paid to Gen Z of late, we are no longer a young nation. By 2030, Americans older than 65 will outnumber under 18s. So 23% versus 20%. And older Americans are living longer. So how are we again building products and services for them and their needs? And I think that means that you need to have people who are in your network or your ecosystem who are informing those products and services. So I think what's cool about this conversation that you and I are having is we get a chance to talk about diversity and all the different ways that it can show up: gender, race, ethnicity, age, geographic location.
Yeah.
Folks who have disabilities who might otherwise not be seen, and we're not building solutions for them, and class. So there's a great way to again tease us apart and make sure that it remains as nuanced as possible, which is tough, by the way. I think
Yeah.
having these conversations is tough, especially in a world where we do want to lean into short, punchy, concise information that people can easily access in all the social media platforms. But I do think that this warrants a deeper look at the opportunity and a more nuanced conversation that I think, again, is tough to have in volatility in
Yeah.
soundbite culture.
Yeah, 100%. We have a couple of questions, and typically I save them for the end, but might as well kind of mix it up. So someone was asking, beyond short-term wins, what do women investors see that others often miss? Um, when I think about how to message this in my organization and with my teams, appreciate any suggestions that you have.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we ground this in opportunities that you might not realize are a big deal. And I've actually heard this show up in three different ways that I'll be as pithy as possible about for you, Anya. So, number one is I've talked to several investors who've said, my experience with infertility allowed me to bring the opportunity to my venture capital firm because they didn't realize what a
Yeah.
big opportunity it was and what a pain point it was for folks. And so now I'm thinking about all the wonderful products and services around that. There's still more opportunity for growth there. But they were able to identify because they had experienced it or people in their community had experienced it. I think number two, and I've heard this broadly from underrepresented founders in working with founders in my last role at Founder Gym. One of the things that we talked about was explaining the market opportunity. And I think underrepresented founders, especially if they have a unique vantage point into their community, and that is not typically represented in a venture capital firm, when they come to the table with the data, they're not always believed because the
Mm.
people around that data don't always have that lived experience. And I think the example that I'm thinking about was a founder who had a really successful wig company and was trying to explain to this investor what the opportunity looked like. And they had to take them to the store so they could see what was happening.
Yeah.
And this person was shocked by how many people use wigs and the diversity of folks who showed
Yeah.
up and the diversity of use cases. And so sometimes you have to show them, which takes an extra step that folks are on the venture side of the table would need to be willing to dig into and see. And then the third thing that I've been thinking about, and I actually just talked to a woman the other day who started a company around PPE in a specific field. And she told me that she's had this conversation with several investors where men don't understand why it's a problem. They're like, I
Yeah.
don't understand why PPE is specifically built for women's bodies or like a femme person's body is important. And what she was able to clearly explain to me was this is a safety issue.
Yeah.
It's not just a fashion issue, which I like to look nice at work. It's like,
Yeah.
it's a safety issue, which means I can't do my job, which also opens the company up for liability. And when she goes in and speaks to women who are in those companies, she's like, they see it immediately and they go back to their company and say, I need you to buy it. So I think the opportunity is really rooted in lived experience, empathy, and I do think a level of compassion for a problem that needs solving, which then allows you to follow the trail to then build out the market sizes. So for the person who asked this question in the chat, thank you. I was going to go back and look because I did see your name. Hey, Rich, is I think really grounding it in, hey, there are markets and there are gaps on our team that that don't allow us to see every opportunity we could go after. And by bringing in folks with diverse perspectives, we're able to capture that. And the other thing I want to say to you is like, this is a tough, I'll just say it like, just because you go hire a person from that specific identity doesn't mean they're going to be able to see the gap in the market. So you have to do the extra work to really make sure that this person has the expertise. This is the field that they're passionate about. And the way that I've heard folks say it is like, it isn't just enough to hire like a woman to join your
Yeah.
team, right? And then you're setting them up for failure if it isn't actually fulfilling the gap that you need on your team. So that's what I would say is like ground it in the data, ground it in the opportunity, showcase a few other places where you've seen this happen and what you're missing out on. I think create FOMO around it.
Yeah, 100%. I keep agreeing with you, but it's because I think what you're saying is so logical and smart. Just because you're bringing in a woman into the organization doesn't mean that she's de facto going to be a more effective investor.
100%.
Have all of the qualifications and all of the expertise, but most likely by virtue of being a woman, she's going to have lived experience that will, give her access to problems or opportunities that men wouldn't necessarily see, and vice versa, right? For example, men or people who I identify as men may not necessarily have the experience with menopause. But then women, on the other hand, will have, won't necessarily have experience with, I don't know, male pattern baldness is the only thing that comes to mind, or, certain other issues that I think are relevant too. So it's just that different kind of nuance and experience that I think creates the opportunities.
That's right. I think that's it. It's like nuance creates opportunity.
Yeah,
And hopefully it's more fun to do the work as well because you get to learn about these other people and these other lived experiences that you don't have. And I think there's so much more benefit than people know until they experience it.
of course. Okay, so we have a couple of other questions, and then I have more, but let's just yeah, let's dive into what some folks are asking. So someone asked any advice for women trying to get clarity on negotiating carry. Feels like nobody talks openly about this.
Yeah, great question. So again, get the data. I know it's hard. We actually have a VC compensation survey that we've been running for a few years now. So feel free, this person, you can email me at paige@allraise.org. Happy to share the data from that so you can understand the trends and maybe use that to negotiate. So what I would say to you is, I just had this conversation with someone the other day. It is a big conversation I have with folks often. What does the data tell you about what's happening in the industry? There's also another great body of research from our friends at Jody Thielander Consulting. I believe it's just J Thielander Consulting. And they have a great data set around compensation as well that you can check out. So I think the first step is getting clear about what the benchmarks look like in the industry. I think number two is talking to other people you trust about how they're negotiating for carry inside of your firm and outside of your firm. I think those combination of viewpoints will then help you come back and share what you're looking for. And then, of course, I think the last piece of this is talking through your track record and the value that you bring to the firm. So those are the three things that I can share immediately, but hopefully that data set will be really helpful to you. And we're looking forward to having more conversations about carry in fact, I think this morning our membership is having a really great session about negotiation and compensation at VC firms. So, a fun plug if you're interested in joining, membership is free at Allraise. And this is one of the sessions that we have at our summit and then also for our members.
Love that. I think, and to whoever asked the question, thank you so much for asking. I think that
Yes.
one of those things where we have to talk about it, and the taboo of not discussing comp or not discussing carry or whatever else actually ends up hurting the individuals rather than the firm or what have you. So it's just so important to kind of to have those discussions. Okay, Paige, another question from someone in the audience. Coming from a nonprofit space, do you think risk tolerance is just code for cultural bias in a lot of firms? Who decides what's too risky, and is that ever challenged in real time?
That's a good question. And so I'm gonna say it aloud again as I process it. I'm verbally processing Anya. We haven't talked about this yet. We're just getting to know each other. But do I think that risk tolerance is just code for cultural bias in a lot of firms? So I think the first question I'd ask, I guess, I think it depends on the firm. And I think that people are all, I think we all are all, let me just say that. I think we are all unaware of how we operationalize our own bias. Full stop. It's just hard to see. And I also think that when you're starting a startup that needs to move as quickly as it does, and I would say there are a lot of venture firms that show up as there are startups, right? Especially these wonderful emerging firms. There's a lot to solve for. And so you're trying to lean on what you know and you're trying to get things done and you're trying to, whether you're at a VC firm and inform your LPs and work with your portfolio companies and run a business at the same time and be a full human. The same thing at a startup. And so I think we don't always realize how our perception of something being risky might actually be rooted in our own bias. And then over time, I think it just gets baked into our processes and we don't think about it. So, first of all, I think you need to be very intentional about interrogating your processes and systems. We do this internally at Allraise, by the way. We think about this a lot. We talk to, in fact, one of the things that we are embarking on now is talking to experts in the venture capital community who are building culture at firms around inclusion and creating really healthy cultures so people can thrive and be successful. Because we know healthy cultures can lead to more successful firms. So that's one piece I would share. I think the other thing I would note here too is that, yeah, of course, I think there is cultural bias that shows up. And I think the opportunity we all have is to push on that and ask questions. I do recognize the power dynamic sometimes, especially those who are asking those questions, maybe from a position or from a background that looks like they're just pushing buttons to push buttons because they're often the one who has to, they must often have to ask these questions, which is really tough. But I think that the more that firms can be reflective about how their processes, because of their unintentional or intentional bias, are stopping them from getting access to opportunities, I think that's the reframe that we need to lean into. And I would say, so who decides what's too risky and is that ever challenged in real time? So I guess I can speak from the nonprofit space, from my experience, again, I think risk is often tied to business outcomes and what you're trying to get done. When I say business outcomes, like what are we doing when it comes to keeping our expenses low? What are we doing when it comes to bringing in enough revenue? And then thinking more broadly about making an impact. And so I think in any of those situations, when you're thinking about risk that way, unless you tie ensuring that your inclusion strategies are tied to improved business outcomes. Unless you can make that link, it may seem easy to pull those things off the plate and not do them, which I think we've seen a lot of, right? Anybody who didn't connect having, a diverse leadership team, anybody who didn't connect having a diverse customer base, those folks who didn't connect business outcomes to their policies around those decisions, I think they're more likely to cut them because they just don't seem like they're driving business outcomes or improving them. So I would say the long story short here is that I think everybody has an opportunity to challenge. That's something I certainly encourage on our team. And number two, I think you need to be really clear about what is risk and how can you leverage practices to include more voices at the table that help you get better outcomes and connect that to the organization's success.
Yeah, for sure. I also think that, especially when you're talking about venture, I think it's interesting how certain funds structure their decision-making processes internally to
Yeah,
try and at least create an opportunity for more people to raise the flag, or for kind of,
yeah.
of course you have your investment committee, and how that's structured is very impactful, but also, observers, and sort of what space is given to folks to disagree, or how voting is done. Does it have to be unanimous, or is there kind of a different structure? So I think that there's also an opportunity internally, like as you're building the fund or as you're kind of creating feedback, to figure out, okay, how do we try and hedge so that we you can never be bias free, but I mean that's not possible, but that we are as sort of evenly weighted as possible, and bringing as many opinions to the table as possible to make the best possible decisions. Yeah.
That's it. That's right.
Looking a little bit more around, value and power, we're kind of in the middle of this conversation right now. Wanted to ask you, if when you're working with your partners internally, and your partners at All Raise, when you're thinking about defining what is a successful fund, or what is a successful investment, how do you define that? Because I think for a lot of, number one, of course, is like returns, but outside of that, how do you see what is successful?
Yeah, I mean, and let me make sure I'm asking this, I'm saying it back to you. So, what does it look like to build a successful organization? Is that right?
For
Can
a
you research?
successful fund? Yeah.
Yeah, a successful fund. So I think building a successful fund again is like, what's your clear thesis and why is everybody on the team the right person to build that organization? I think this is just like a startup, right? So like, what's our unique vantage point? What are we going to double down on? And being really clear about having the right team who can do that. So I think that's
Yeah.
a huge starting point is being very clear about that from the very beginning. And then I think the story is much easier to tell because as you're going to talk to LPs or as you're going to talk to founders, that story needs to be crystal clear. The
Yeah.
like, why this thesis? Why you? And then I think what's great about this over time is that you're able to use that as a North Star when, again, we talk about all the volatility that's happening. I think the next piece of this is I've heard the best investors that I talk to are very service oriented. They're
Right.
very focused on creating value for and supporting the success of the portfolio companies that they invest in. And so that could look like sitting down and meeting with you on a regular basis to help you identify new talent, to give you really tough feedback, to help you navigate challenging situations, to help you prepare to IPO, whatever it might be. The best investors that I've talked to are very hands-on in a way that feels like a partnership and somebody who can be, it's like a marriage, right?
Yeah.
It's not something that you can easily step out of. And so there's an opportunity to build a level of candor and a deep relationship that can help you both be successful. I think the last piece of this, and I've been thinking about this more, is firms that build really great cultures can help them be resilient. So when I think about great venture capital firms that I've been talking to lately, one thing that I've noticed is they're identifying the right talent, and then they're helping that talent grow. And then that talent spins out sometimes and builds their own firm, right? Or maybe they build a new vertical inside of that firm. But it's just a net positive for the ecosystem when we train really great investors who can see really great opportunities and again can be really great partners to founders. There is so much that the ecosystem can gain from that. And so I'm really excited to see what the ecosystem looks like moving forward as we see those folks who've been, I think, well trained in this apprentice model either take over a firm or continue to grow new verticals or step
Yeah.
out and start something new.
I love that. I think it was I believe it's Lightspeed Ventures. They had this really fantastic, and I think it's been kind of restructured, but they're still going in partnership with a few other funds, but this emerging investors program. Where they would bring them in and sort of, train them and kind of create partnerships and then sort of see these emerging investors emerge and go and do these amazing investments. And I think that the value that was created to the ecosystem and the returns that they were able to see were fantastic. And because the vast majority of participants were from, underrepresented backgrounds or what have you, the deal flow that they were able to see was so much larger than what they had previously seen. So it ended up starting, I think, as almost like a community kind of initiative, but then what ended up happening is that they actually got so much deal flow out of it, and it was like a thing of beauty, right?
That's
Yeah.
exactly right. It's a thing of beauty. I think that's the opportunity. And with that, if you don't mind, I wanted to go back. Rich was asking for clarity in the chat, and thanks, Rich, for asking about our question earlier, what women investors see that others often miss. And I think the heart of the question, actually, Kate started talking about this. But yes, Rich, what we're talking about is when you add women to teams, they bring value. And for us specifically, we also think about non-binary folks adding their perspective to teams as opposed to teams that are composed of all men because it brings new perspectives. I would say it can be vice versa, by the way. If you have a team of all one group of people, bringing in, like, if you're a team of all women, bringing in a man can give you a new perspective, or bringing in non-binary folks can be a new perspective. And so what the data tells us is it's about adding more diverse perspectives to your team that give you access to opportunities and networks that you might not otherwise see. So the question we talked about was really narrow, but that's kind of like the bigger context. So Rich, let me know. And then Kate, also thank you for popping into the chat. Anya, I don't know if you had anything else to add about
No,
that.
that's well said. We have a few more questions in the chat, and I know that we don't have a ton of time, but I'm going to try and squeeze these in. Okay, so Paige, what are some founder red flags, quote unquote, people still rely on that end up filtering out women-led companies unfairly?
Yeah, well, there's a great body of research, and I'm forgetting off the top of my brain right now, but I'm happy to share it in the chat afterwards. I'll find it for us. But one thing that I've heard about over and over again are women being asked about the risk more than the opportunity.
Mhm.
And so leaning into like poking holes where it's not going to work more than asking about where it is going to work, where is the big market that you can go after. And so I think that's one thing. And again, if you have been trained and you've been watching this happen, even if it's not intentional, we internalize that bias, we don't realize it. And that can happen, by the way, regardless of who the investor is. So I
Yeah.
think that's super interesting to, again, keep in mind is that we are all capable of doing this. I think the second piece of it is talking about the market size and not believing that there's a big enough opportunity here. And I've seen a few examples of this very recently. And so what I would say is I'm excited to see in the ecosystem more and more white papers coming out, published by people in the all raised community who are talking about market opportunities that I think previously were considered niche. So Cake Ventures has a great set of white papers where they talk about the opportunity, specifically, actually, the $1 trillion female economy talks about the buying power of women and how they're not a monolith, right? There are all these different ways that we make decisions in our families every day that impact consumer spending and impact the health and success of the economy. So I do know that, I've talked to so many women and non-binary folks who go and pitch their company, or even underrepresented folks, including men, who then hear, well, this isn't a big enough market. We just don't think we can scale big enough. But they, one, don't see what's possible today, but then also how that opportunity can actually transcend maybe a really specific niche in the beginning to solve for more people. So I do think that there is an opportunity for firms who are maybe thinking of like, well, this isn't big enough to either say like, okay, I'm either going to ask, I'm going to talk through with you what the opportunity is and make sure we're both on the same page about what it could look like. So again, leaning into how awesome it could be and not how awful it could be, though that's a big part of the process. So you have to interrogate the idea, but then also doing your own market research to make
Yeah.
sure that you truly understand, which is an extra step. But again, that extra step opens up opportunity.
Yeah, yeah, totally agreed. It's funny. So we do Diversio has a learning and development arm to the business. It's called Optimal.
Hmm.
One of the trainings that we do that comes to mind is specifically for investors, and it's around basically debiasing or trying to debias the investment process. So
Yes.
that you're not missing out on opportunities. And I just pulled up the training just to take a look, and it's interesting. So there are two types of, there was a study done, and there's two types of questions that are asked, right? Promotional questions, which is something like questions on potential gains, right? Something like, how do you want to acquire customers? How do you monetize this or whatever? And then preventative questions, which are focused on losses, right? So how long will it take you to break even? Things like that.
Yes.
And 66% of questions posed to women entrepreneurs were prevention oriented. So they
This
were
is the data.
focused.
That's right.
And then
Yes.
67% of questions posed to men entrepreneurs were promotion oriented. And which is, a huge, huge difference. But the kind of the punchline is that entrepreneurs who were fielding mostly prevention questions were aggregated 7 times less funds. So if we're inherently have those, unconscious biases within the process, then it ultimately impacts how investment is allocated. And I think, there's definitely, more kind of open red flags, like you saying, oh, well, she's in her early 30s, so she's probably not going to be as committed because she's going to go have a baby or something like that. But I think that the more, and that's kind of insidious, that's sort of like open kind of bias and discrimination. But I think that the more pervasive and prevalent, if someone doesn't want to be or is mindful about how they're thinking about things, is things like that. It's the type of questions that you're asking and how they lead to the outcome. So yeah, not to plug our training, but I love it. I think it's really interesting. So if
Yeah,
anyone even
that's it.
that's happy to give them. Um, anyway, so another question, and I think this might be our last one. I know we're gonna run over time. But in light of recent challenges to DEI initiatives, how can nonprofits advocate for inclusion without jeopardizing funding?
Yeah, I think this is really tough. The reality is that we've seen funding disappear for lots of organizations who've been doing this work. So I think what we have done is we've just really leaned into the data and ask ourselves, what has the data been saying for decades now about the opportunity here? And I think what's exciting is that it's not new, right? It's not fresh data. We have lots of great data that point us in this direction, that having more diverse teams who make decisions can improve the outcomes for a startup or for a venture firm. So I'm really excited about that. I think what's tough is that we'll need to continue to bring people closer together to have these conversations in a way that helps educate those who don't see it about why there is a big opportunity here. And so, what I've seen several organizations do is one, they've leaned in closer to education and informing folks about why the work is important, again, leaning into data. I think number two is building really strong relationships with folks where you can sit down person to person to have a conversation. And again, I want to pull us out of like volatility soundbite culture, which is part of the world that we live in right now, and say, like, let's sit down and have a conversation. And for those who don't understand why these are the decisions that organizations have made and have just leaned into, let's talk about it because I think there are so many of us who are interested in having that conversation. I do also think that in this time, I think coalition building is really important.
Yeah.
So I think I'm so happy we're having this conversation, but so many of the organizations out there doing work that is very similar to our work, we sit down and have conversations about what we can do to inform the ecosystem, what we can do to publish data that talks about why this is important, why you are able to invest in diverse leadership. Again, for us, it's primarily around gender, but what does diversity look like in all those different verticals that we talked about earlier? And how do we help make it easier for people? So it's not just telling the story, leveraging the data, and giving examples of real people who are doing this and doing it well, but then also giving people easy systems and processes that they can then leverage to, address issues within their own firm, their own organization. So I do think it's data, I think it's storytelling, and I think it's processes and systems.
Yeah.
And I will say that with all the noise going on, there are a lot of people who are still doubling down in this work because they believe the data and they see the
Yeah.
opportunity.
Yeah. It's funny on the processes and systems. I was talking to someone the other day. He actually runs inclusion at CIBC, which is one of the biggest banks in Canada. And what he said, it really struck me. He said they can never come after you, or they can never make debiasing a system illegal. So if you, and that really landed with me, because it just, I think, a mindset shift around, okay, maybe we talk about it a little bit differently now. Maybe we're looking at, okay, the like ensuring inclusive processes within the organization. How do we structure those? Like, what is the way that we can debias? And I think if you're in the US, if you talk about it in that way and you continue doing the work, I think you're more insulated than you might think, because you're actually even on side of the executive orders. Nobody can ever come after you for, removing discrimination or bias from processes. And so I don't know, that just really landed with me. And I thought, we know a lot of organizations that we work with that, are federal contractors, for example, in the US, and they have so much desire to continue on with their work. It's just slightly changing and potentially rebranding and, calling things a little bit of a different name, but continuing to do what they've committed to do and to their employees, and what they've been doing for years. It's hard. You have to get creative in a lot of ways, and you have to get flexible, and it's scary, of course, especially if you're a nonprofit that is relying on federal funding or what have you. But there are ways to continue on, exactly like you said, just maybe a little bit more carefully, or in a bit more of a nuanced way. But anyway, sorry, I realize we're over time. Maybe I'll just pass it off to you for one closing remark. If there's any kind of piece of advice that you would give investors that are navigating, maybe new and emerging investors that are navigating the investing world right now, or even aspiring investors who are looking to raise funds, or what have you, what would you leave them with?
Yeah, I think that there are two things that are coming to me, and then I'll share one final thought based on what you just said. The first is be really clear about why you're the right person to do your job, and like be crystal clear about that. And so when you walk into a room, people are like, yes, that is the person. I understand why they're the right person to build that firm, and I want to work with them. And again, the I want to work with them could be an LP, it could be an employee, it could be a co-founder, it could be somebody that you invest in. I think number two is ignore the noise, focus on what you can control and what you can do, and remember that this is a long game. So there's always going to be noise of a different kind. There's always going to be spin of a different kind in the world. And if you are too anchored to what's happening out there, you can't do what you're uniquely positioned to do. And that's what the ecosystem needs, right? People who are like, they're there because they see unique opportunities and they can run with it. So I would say that. I think the last piece overall is, I did see the person's question in the chat, and thank you for that about like D and I. I think whatever language we use, we need to lean into the fact that this isn't about excluding other people. This isn't about kicking people out based on their race or their gender or their ethnicity. It is about growing the pie for everyone. It is about creating new opportunity for everyone. And I come from a really small town in Missouri, and I want folks from my small town to also have access to opportunity. I want them to have solutions and problems also built for them. And so I think the framing here, whatever language we use, D&I, equity, diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's about giving people a shot at being part of the American dream. And I think that we have an opportunity to do that when we have more voices at the table who can represent those perspectives. And I think that's an exciting future. And that is a hopeful future. And that's why I get up every day to do my work and why I feel really excited to do that work in this space right now.
Wow. I'm feeling really inspired. Paige, thank you so much for joining. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you, everyone who joined live, and thank you to everyone who's going to watch this recorded. And have a wonderful, wonderful day. And Paige, onwards and upwards. Bye.